Welcome back to Take a Leap and Transform, a neurodiversity journey. I'm your host, Joseph K. Muscat. Are you ready to take a leap with
Can't
me?
complain.
In this episode,
Things
I'm
are
pleased to be
generally pretty
talking
good.
about three things: entrepreneurship, startups, and a new app dedicating to
Yeah,
supporting
more or less.
ADHD called Focus
Definitely
Bear.
feeling a lot better than I
I'm
was
joined by
last
the
time we
app's
spoke.
creator and fellow neurodivergent, Jeremy Nagel. Jeremy is a neurodiverse software developer turned entrepreneur. He is the founder of Focus Bear, a habit stacking and productivity app for people with ADHD. His favorite party trick is leaving parties early so he can get to sleep on time to do his 3-hour-long morning routine. I can relate. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hi, Joseph. Great to be here.
Thanks for coming on. And as I said in my intro, there are three particular topics I really wanted to talk about. And it's great to have you on to be able to discuss that. So let's start off, though. I want the viewers to get to know you a little bit better. And let's start off the conversation because you were diagnosed late in life, where you found out that you were both ADHD and autistic in your adult years. How did that come about?
Yeah, it was something that essentially the diagnosis happened last year. The autism side of it wasn't a surprise for me. It's something that I had suspected since my teenage years. And essentially, I just hadn't got a diagnosis because the financial barriers made it a little bit tricky. I'd done a pre-diagnosis maybe 5 years ago, and that had given me some reassurance in some ways. And just even having an understanding that I might be autistic was really helpful for me in self-acceptance, in making me feel less bad about the challenges that I had in masking in social situations and how difficult I found it being around office environments which were very busy and highly stimulating. I ended up then formalizing the diagnosis last year. I had a bit more money and was able to do it privately at that point. And the ADHD side, that really came out of the blue because it's not something that I had thought about for a long time. It was only really something that I started to realize as I began following people on TikTok and other places like that. And there's ADHD influencers who talk about ADHD hacks. And I realized, hang on a sec, a lot of the problems that they're discussing in terms of poor punctuality, being really messy, skating from task to task, I actually empathize with that. And the hacks that they recommended, they seem to actually work quite well for me. And then when I spoke to the psychologist and went through the assessment, I think I was something like 15 out of 18 criteria for the ADHD assessment. So it is something that I can relate to strongly. I guess the reason why it felt surprising to me is because I have that idea that ADHD manifests itself in people being very physically hyperactive. And that was never me when I was a kid. I think the autistic side of me meant that I tend to follow rules quite strongly. I've never smoked, I've never done drugs, I've never got up in the middle of class and ran around and did crazy things. But internally, I felt very hyperactive. And even these days, I've recognized that getting up and doing active things during the day actually really helps me to focus. That if I'm asked to sit down for extended periods of time, I do find that quite challenging.
It's interesting in a number of factors. The first factor being is that you've had a bit of a journey in getting your diagnosis. There was an early diagnosis, there was a delay in that diagnosis. You mentioned the financial barrier. That's definitely a particular concern and issue for a lot of neurodivergents. Getting that financial barrier, getting that diagnosis because of that financial barrier is what I should say. And the cost factor that plays into it. And that also brings into the aspect where you've indicated, and it's not the first time I've heard it as well, where there's there's a lot of self-diagnosis happening. And I've had a bit of that self-diagnosis as well, coming from watching, as you mentioned, TikTok and YouTube and what have you on ADHD. I'm not formally diagnosed with ADHD, and I think I have what is called inattentive ADHD, if I diagnose myself correctly. And it's because again, like you, I see a lot of those similar traits. I'm curious, in regards to that financial barrier, Do you think that that was a great hindrance to you in getting a proper diagnosis sooner rather than later?
Yeah, it was. Part of the issues that I experienced as someone in my early 20s was a lot of job instability. I got fired from about 4 jobs in a row, essentially, at the start of my career. And I think it was mainly the autistic traits. I had a lot of issues with just giving feedback incorrectly and not really reading social cues, which led me to not harmonizing too well with my manager and the ADHD side in terms of poor punctuality. That also resulted in me being fired from a relatively good job. All of that meant that, yeah, I didn't have much money, and I was struggling sometimes week by week. And the idea of shelling out $2,000 for an assessment, that was not really a luxury that I could afford at that point.
Hmm.
But as I got a bit more secure in my career and was able to, I guess, potentially due to having greater awareness and developing better technical skills as well, my finances did improve a bit, and I was able to afford it later down the track. But it's still, I mean, $2,500, which is what I spent on the assessment, is not chump change. It's something that I would rather not have to spend on a diagnosis. And I imagine for a lot of people, they feel that way as well. But it's nice for me just having clarity around the issues that I have. And it has, I mean, I haven't necessarily sought any government assistance or anything like that, but it has meant that I've felt comfortable to go and get ADHD coaching. And I haven't done a great deal with the autistic side of things. I think over time I've developed my own strategies that work well, but it's useful for me rather than trying to force myself to go into situations which are going to be very hard for me. I have greater self-acceptance that I don't necessarily have to push myself in some ways, that I have areas that are just always going to be challenging for me. And that's the way my brain works. And that's okay, because I've got other ways where my brain excels at it. And I can just spend more time in my strengths rather than my weaknesses, and not worry about trying to excessively polish my weaknesses in some cases.
Absolutely, and definitely focus on the strengths. That's something I talk about a lot. It's interesting too. You mentioned the social cues and the feedback aspects and what society expects as being the social norm of, which is of course being mainly neurotypical. It's always that bridge and that catch-22 of trying to be yourself but also fit in to what is expected, and it's always that tug of war. And at the same time, I think it's also challenging in the aspect that the other side expects you to adapt to them, but they're not willing to, or they lack the understanding of who you are and accepting you for who you are. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I do agree to some extent. I think in this case, in the job that I'm thinking about, where I had given the inappropriate feedback, it probably was a fair decision on the part of the organization, because the organization is a consulting company and their employees are essentially their brand and their reputation. So to have someone go to a client and potentially communicate in an inappropriate way, where the client doesn't really have the context of who I am, that I can understand why they were cautious about it. I've typically done a lot better in small product teams where there's only, say, 5 people that I interact with generally, and they get to know me pretty well. And they realize that if I'm sometimes a bit gruff or brusque, that it's not because I hate them. It might just be because I'm feeling overstimulated that day. And I now can also be a lot more transparent. Like, I've told my manager about my diagnosis, and that's probably helpful in terms of her just having a bit more awareness and sometimes letting things pass, and also sometimes telling me that, hey, Jeremy, maybe the way that you spoke to that person, that may not be optimal, and if you can, try and avoid it next time. And that has been very helpful for me, just in some cases not trying too hard, and in other cases trying hard because it does matter in certain contexts.
That's interesting because in your new job versus your previous job, or your previous job experience, should I say, there was a willingness from your current manager to be, who had that understanding, and at the same time the willingness to be a buffer for you. And it's interesting in the aspect that it's hyperbole now, but if there was an understanding in your previous job and there was that buffer, then perhaps things would have worked out differently for you.
Yeah, potentially. And I think there's probably greater awareness of neurodiversity now as well. And I definitely would feel comfortable disclosing that earlier on in the job application and recruitment process, and maybe things would have gone quite differently. But yeah, ultimately, that job wouldn't have been a good fit for me because it involved a lot of travel. It involved a lot of being in high stakes situations, having to communicate with people that I didn't know well. And I think it would have been very stressful for me. So I'm glad that I didn't end up staying in that role, and I did learn a lot during the process. But yeah, travel and new situations all the time are not great for me.
Well, sometimes, things were meant to be, right? My point though is the awareness and having that support where someone was being a buffer for you, which is what you're having now. And
Yeah.
with that in mind, you mentioned now upfront and disclosing. From your experience then, what's your opinion on that? Because there's always this tug of war. Should you disclose or should you not disclose? And right now you're having a bit of a positive experience. So would you recommend disclosing?
It's probably hard to give a blanket rule. I feel pretty confident in my career right now that I've got 10 years experience in tech, and my technical skills are pretty sharp, and I've got some career successes that make me relatively employable. And so I don't feel worried about disclosing now. But early on in my career, I'm not sure about that. It might really depend on the organization. That if the organization had stated goals around diversity and inclusion, I'd probably feel okay about bringing it up. But if it was an organization that maybe was less accommodating, then I'd question working for that company. But it might also be difficult. There might not be many options, and it would be a case by case basis.
No, I agree with your analysis. It's this, it's what I coach to others. I'm a big advocate for disclosing, because you need to become an advocate for yourself. At the same time, though, you have to judge the organization based on, as you said, whether they're open to diversity and inclusion or not, and that will determine whether or not it is safe to disclose. And another way to kind of find out as well is we are all on LinkedIn. You can find out on LinkedIn on who is working there. Maybe message someone who's currently working there and ask them what work-life culture is like. You can also potentially find out who was previously working there and ask them what was work-life culture like, and why did they leave, and that will help you gauge on whether or not is it potentially safe to disclose or not. Now, I want to get into two questions here, and before we move forward with the second question, you had mentioned that you had seen signs earlier in life. So then, prior to your diagnosis, and that's both, of course, your self-diagnosis and your official diagnosis, what was life like, basically the early years for you?
Way I think about it is, when I was a kid, I was very immersed in books. I'd read generally for hours at a time, and that was probably an early manifestation of ADHD, hyperfocus, and perhaps the similar traits in autism as well. And I wasn't very interested in other kids. I did have friends, but I wouldn't tend to talk to them that much. It was more playing, we call it octopus, where you'd run around and try and tag each other, and playing ball games and things like that. And I don't think that anyone really noticed it as a child. I was very academically strong, and other kids typically respected that. Where it started to become a bit more obvious was probably around the end of primary school, and definitely the start of high school, where kids started getting interested in relationships, and there were boyfriend-girlfriend relationships starting to emerge. And I was so far behind that. I was probably several years ahead of my peers academically and several years behind socially. I was still afraid of talking to girls when I was 12, to the extent where I was voted school captain, and we had to do this exercise once per year where we would go and get all of the classes to come for school photos. And I had to do that with the female school captain. And for the whole day, even though this is an exercise that obviously requires coordination between us to figure out what time we're going to go and get grade 4 from this teacher, I didn't talk to her at all. Instead, at various intervals, I'd be looking at my watch the whole time. And then every 10 minutes, I would just run off without even looking at her and expect her to follow me. And then we'd go to the classroom and I would talk to the teacher and say, it's time for your photos. And I think that's a bit abnormal in a 12-year-old. And I did struggle in high school as well. There were some bullying dynamics that were going on where some of the kids picked on me a little bit. And I didn't really enjoy year 7 and 8. I skipped a lot of school. It was a bit better once I went to a selective entry high school where the focus was a lot more on academics. But I felt a lot of constant self-doubt, and I didn't enjoy the high school experience where it felt like a lot of the socializing was around one-upmanship, and the other boys would be doing a lot of banter, and I didn't feel like I could keep up. I didn't really feel like I had many real friends in high school. It was a bit better in university. I think there were more opportunities then to have niche interests. And I was able to join various societies that aligned to my interests and find people who were I was very big into environmental sustainability and still am. It was nice being able to have a lot of friends who shared those kind of values, because that probably speaks to the autistic side in terms of general social difficulty, but also specialized interests and the ability to talk people's head off and enjoy conversations where it's something very niche. But if you ask me to talk about Formula One or what happened on the footy last night or general interest TV shows, I'm going to struggle because that's not something that I enjoy. And I did generally, things did get a bit better probably around that time in the university years, because I started reading a lot of books about social skills essentially. And I started learning explicitly what other people learn implicitly during their childhood, just in terms of turn-taking in conversations and how to ask questions and how to make eye contact, really basic things, or things that probably seem basic to the normal population, but which felt like a new language to me. Got a bit better after that. I think that's part of why the drive for a diagnosis was perhaps less, because I did develop some coping skills and I did learn how to mask to a certain extent.
Thank you for sharing that. Drive is a very common thread that I've experienced, and that with talking with others about their experiences growing up. And it's again very typical from an autistic spectrum or neurodivergent spectrum, where you are ahead academically, but behind socially. And it's usually around the university years where you start to be able to catch up and become a little bit more aware, and also you're also able to pick the types of social groups that you want to be part of, versus in the early years, you really, the options are not as opportunistic and individualized as it is in a university. So I can understand how that came to be, and I can also relate, because that's how I tend to have bloomed as well as during my university years. Socially wise, I can completely relate. I'm not a big fan of high school for a lot of things that you've pointed out already. So with your diagnosis now, how has your life, your work, your business, how has this diagnosis have helped improve those situations?
Probably the biggest change is around the ADHD diagnosis, because like I said, it was a surprise to me, but looking back, it probably shouldn't have been a surprise, that as well as the social difficulties, which are probably more on the autistic side, I found it very hard to keep focus on one job. And for my entire career, I've always had multiple jobs. I I started as a freelancer, and I had generally 10 different projects going because I couldn't just say yes to one. I liked the novelty. And even when I ended up getting a full-time job, I kept the freelancing going, and I had side businesses going at the same time as well. And that's something that I always felt a little bit guilty about, but now I recognize it as that's who I am, that I like to be involved in a lot of things, and it's actually okay. But I do need to be careful about how I manage that it's not really cool for me to be working on my side businesses or my hobbies during my day job hours. And that's something that I've gotten a bit better at. And there are also more concrete things around, for example, I think there's probably about 4 dimensions that I've got some improvement in after the diagnosis: cooking, relationships, the ability to pay attention during meetings, and losing items. I could go into each of them if you like.
Sure.
Okay, so with cooking, I have a bad track record of burning pots. I tend to start cooking, and then I have an idea and I go back to my computer, or I go and work on something else. And then my sense of smell isn't very acute. So I typically don't smell the burning before my wife does. And then there's this mad dash to go and save the burning pot, which isn't great for relationship harmony. And my solution for that is that I don't cook with saucepans anymore unless I am with my wife. Instead, I use the microwave, or I use a rice cooker, or I bought this special steamer, all of which have either a timer that I have to set, or they have means of detecting when they're out of water. So that the steamer is great because it will turn itself off when it's out of water, and so does the rice cooker. And I haven't burnt many pots since I started using them. So that was a bit of a revelation that I don't need to try what works for other people, because my wife was always asking me, why don't you just put the timer on the induction cooktop? But for me, that doesn't work because it's not obvious. I mean, the cooktop, it uses Chinese characters. My wife is Chinese and we bought it from China. So I don't really know which characters to use, and B, it's just not intuitive to me. That's something that I've always struggled with, remembering to set a timer. When I was in university, I was doing my honors year in a biochemistry lab, and I had to set timers around when to take the E. coli off the shaker. And I'd never remember to do it. I'd kill the E. coli. I think I'm just not well set up for things that require me to have short-term memory in a situation like that. But I am great at where I can set up systems where I configure it once and then it will always work for me. So I do that with the cooking. And then in terms of meetings, I found that for me, having a meeting with you like this is fine because I'm involved, you're involved, I'm listening to you. But in a situation where there's about 5 people on the call and I'm not really deeply involved in the conversation, I've always found that a real challenge. It was okay when I was working in the office, or I would kind of mostly handle it because the social expectations around that when you're in a meeting like that people can see you very obviously if you're tuning out. But when I'm working from home, I really do find that a struggle, and there's a tendency for me to multitask, which is not ideal. So I've found that now I go for a walk when I'm in a meeting like that if I do need to pay attention, I just can't do it if I'm sitting at my desk. The temptation to multitask is too great. And I'm unapologetic about that now. I do that all the time, and I tell my colleagues that I'm not going to be in front of my computer because otherwise I won't listen. And that's really helpful for me, that busy hands, quiet mind really works for me, that I'm able to pay attention a lot more in that situation. And then trying to remember the other 2 things that I had, I guess, around just awareness of that it can be challenging for me to stick to boring tasks, that if there's something that isn't super stimulating for me, I can do it, but I need to use some of the tactics that I've learned from reading books relating to ADHD and some of the TikTokers. So body doubling works really well for me. having someone nearby that is doing it at the same time, or even just that I tell them I'm going to be working on this for 20 minutes. And also blocking distractions, which comes into the Focus Bear app. And then I guess the last thing is probably around relationships, that the autistic side of me has very low social requirements, and that can be a bit of a mismatch that has led to a lot of relationship disharmony in the past. I've had quite a few breakups in a short amount of time. Like I had, prior to meeting my wife, I was dating 4 women, and those relationships all lasted about 3 to 6 months. Basically, the honeymoon period where I was very interested in them and I put a lot of effort in. And then basically after that point, I started getting immersed in my own hobbies and stopped paying attention to my partner. And that led to the relationships breaking down predictably. And I've really had to be quite intentional about recognizing that my wife has a lot higher need for quality time, and probably a more normal need for quality time than me. I'm really quite happy to have a very limited amount of social interaction each day. I do need some, but I'm happy with maybe 10 minutes per day. That basically fills my social needs. Whereas for her, it's more on the order of probably an hour with me, and she likes to have dinner with me and we'll go for a walk together. And I don't mind doing that, but it's not obvious to me that I should do that. And so we've had a lot of conversations about that in terms of me getting to know what her social needs are and me being willing to accommodate it and changing my schedule a bit so that I do have that quality time set up for her.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And it's kind of funny, as you're talking, there are definitely 3 of the 4 I can completely relate to. And I'm sure the other listeners can as well. The burning of the pots, I found really funny because I do the same thing. I start something and I come back to my office to work on other things, and I get immersed in what I'm doing, and then the pot's burning and my wife's getting upset. So I can completely, utterly relate. It's and then the meetings I'm okay, actually. But definitely blocking distractions. The dyslexia in me or the ADHD in me, I don't know what it is. But I get easily distracted, and it takes me a while to get back to being focused again, and then I get distracted again. So I can understand that. And the last point as well, it's hard for me to say because one aspect of it is definitely not only just autistic, but also ADHD. A lot of ADHD, you describe a typical ADHD scenario where there is a honeymoon period, and then they get immersed in what they're doing, and the other partner feels like they're not getting attention and so forth. It's very relatable to ADHD. I get immersed, but at the same time, I try to give attention. So I'm a little bit on the fence on that one. But I completely, and I love the strategies that you put into place and how you try to compensate for that. And that's funny enough, you pretty much answered the next question I had. Hey, listeners, I want to share with you a new program that I've put together to bring awareness and to up-level the skills of employers and managers. The workshops aids in building more inclusive environments in the workplace for neurodiverse talent and in developing skills of managers to be more engaging with their teams. Reach out to me on my website to learn more about this amazing program. I want to now talk about entrepreneurship because you mentioned that earlier, and you mentioned that you tend to do a lot of side things going on. So I get the sense that from your ideas that you're generating internally, there's this need to obviously start creating. So is that what draws you to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had my first business when I was about 15, which was selling cheap bots for RuneScape, this online game that I was obsessed about. That's how I learned to code as well, that I was playing this game where you had to do a lot of clicking in order to kill chickens and gather feathers or mine coal. And there was this community around reverse engineering the game and making automated bots that would do the clicking for us. So I really got into immersive states of hyperfocus around that, and would work until 3 a.m. in the morning. My mum thought I was crazy and was saying that I was spending all this time on mindless games, but it actually set me up for the career that I've had subsequently. And I do feel a drive to put my ideas out there. I had that. The first business was that cheat bot game, and then I had more legitimate businesses after that. That when I was probably starting after I graduated from uni, I started freelancing initially. I had found an opportunity to do some work with a system called Zoho, which has a customer relationship management system and bookkeeping and project management and 60 other apps. And I just fell into that. I was doing some volunteer work, basically doing an unpaid internship, and there was an opportunity where they needed a database built. We had a very short amount of time, and I ended up being able to build something using Zoho for that. They ended up liking it so much that they paid me for that job. And I thought, well, if I could do it in this situation, maybe I can do it in other situations as well, and started using Upwork. I got a lot of freelancing gigs out of that. But that issue that I talked about a bit earlier around not being able to say no, I accidentally grew my freelancing business, which would have worked really well as a one-person business. I turned it into a 10-person business very quickly, where I had a bunch of other subcontractors working for me, and I didn't have the business acumen to actually manage my cash flow, to figure out how to coordinate all these different projects. And I had a situation where I just had so many projects going, and some of them were delivered late because I hired people who didn't have the right skills. And then I was having to pay the subcontractors beyond what I was actually getting paid from the clients. And I ended up going into a lot of debt. And at the same time, I was also working on a business that was a carpooling business for runners, because I'd experienced a challenge for myself as someone who was very into doing long distance running, where I like to do these fun runs and marathons, which would typically start quite early on a Sunday morning when there was no public transport. I didn't have a car or a license, so I couldn't actually get there on my own. And I wanted to have a way of connecting with fellow runners who would be able to, basically, we would drive together and I would pay for the fuel cost. And that, I mean, I had some good experiences with that. I did this ultra marathon where I got a lift with someone, and I coordinated about probably maybe 100 other lifts. I liked the idea so much that I was putting a lot of my money into that, which didn't work so well when the business wasn't very profitable. And then I was drawing money out as well to work on this other carpooling business. The end result was basically that I ended up with about $50,000 of credit card debt. And then I couldn't really keep going with the business at that point, because it wasn't profitable, and I definitely couldn't continue to hire subcontractors. So that was immensely stressful. I ended up getting some support from a peer support program there, where other people who struggled with debt as well. And I learned some skills around how to more effectively run a business without incurring debt. But for a long time, I essentially made the business a very small part of my working life. I continued to do the freelancing, but I did it on my own with a much smaller team. And in the meantime, I got a conventional job as a programmer. I did that for a couple of years, a few false starts, like I mentioned earlier, around getting fired from the first couple of jobs. But I then did find companies which were smaller teams, where it was, there weren't any expectations of talking to clients, which was good for me. And I generally was able to build up my technical skills and become a decent programmer. And that continued for probably 5 years of doing that. And then I started getting a bit of momentum around the side business, the Zoho work that I was doing. I found that I was getting recurring requests with the consulting work to do the same type of work, where people were asking me to do a sales assignment tool, where they would assign new potential customers to different salespeople, depending on making sure that it was even, that if Bob got the last 5 potential customers, then Jane should get the next 5, that sort of thing, a round robin arrangement. And I built a software product around that, essentially encapsulating what I've been doing in my consulting, and put that on the Zoho marketplace, which was a new opportunity where developers like me could sell their products and people could just go and install it. I didn't have to actually talk to the clients. They could just go and install it and they would use the software on their own. And that ended up doing okay, not a huge business, but it gave me a bit of a taste of what it was like to have a product where I didn't have to do the work directly, but instead I built something and people paid every month for it in a software as a service model. And that was very motivating for me to think that maybe in the future I might be able to build something else that would have much more revenue coming in, and that I might have a lot more freedom then with my time. Ultimately, that happened with my next business, which was a SMS integration for Zoho CRM. And that ended up being probably 15 times bigger than the round robin business, generated a decent amount of revenue. I was able to hire a team of 5 people to help me with that. And importantly, someone to do the customer support, because I was very bad at customer support. I just get annoyed at customers if they would ask questions and essentially be writing passive aggressive emails saying, didn't you read the user manual? It's very clear, it's very obvious. I don't understand why you're asking this question. So I'm not the right person for that type of job, but I hired someone who was amazingly patient and was willing to re-explain things to customers. He was my buffer in this situation. I think that's been important for me. You were talking about that earlier. I realize now that I've basically had people like that in most of the jobs where I've been able to be successful in, where I've been able to be the guy who gets very immersed in the code, and that's where I like to be. And then I've had other people who handle the softer parts of human interaction. Ultimately, what happened with that business was I hadn't planned it, but I got approached by a large company who wanted to have a presence in the Zoho ecosystem. They were an SMS provider as well, and they reached out to me on LinkedIn and asked me if I would consider selling the business to them, which was very surprising because I hadn't seen it as a business that would be something that another company would want, and I hadn't prepared for it. But ultimately, after getting some help from a friend who is very good at negotiation, I ended up selling the business in February 2022, which was amazing for me financially and a big achievement as an entrepreneur to have been able to do that. And I've been working for that company for the last 13 months or so, continuing the transition as my small product has become part of now a 5,000 person company. And that has been satisfying, but also challenging for me. There's a lot more dynamics in terms of office politics and stakeholder management, which I'm not great at, but I've got people who assist me a little bit with that.
Well, that's amazing, and thank you for sharing, your passion for entrepreneurship and your journey through entrepreneurship. From what you've described, and you've touched upon a little bit here and there, what tips would you give to a fellow neurodivergent who's looking at doing a startup, or has a number of ideas and has gone through maybe one entrepreneurship venture after another? What tips and advice would you give based out of your experience?
I've got 3. The first one is don't get into credit card debt. I think there's a temptation that I followed to try and go really big, really fast. And that actually is not helpful, both in terms of the personal financial cost of that, but also the way that a business is set up. I've realized that my tendency is that I don't really like talking to potential customers. I find that very scary, but that's actually the most important part. There's this discussion of the difference between product development versus customer development. Product development is where you come up with an idea and you start coding and you build in isolation, whereas customer development involves starting by talking to people and finding out what are their needs, what problems do they have that I could solve for them. And that the difference there is between my carpooling business, where I had a problem myself and I was trying to solve it, but it wasn't really a problem that a lot of people had. There were some other runners who liked the idea, but it wasn't really going to be a huge business in the manifestation that I had it. Whereas with the round robin business and the SMS business, there were people actually asking me to build that. And so there wasn't any uncertainty about whether it was going to be in demand. There was existing market demand. I'd already demonstrated that through the consulting side. And then it's an easy decision after that to build it based on that. But even with that dynamic, I still did it very cheaply initially. I did most of the development work myself for a long time. I only started hiring people once I actually had revenue coming in, because otherwise, yeah, there's a lot of danger in getting into credit card debt. It is very stressful. So I'd recommend avoiding that. My second tip would be around just embracing, with the ADHD side, embracing the desire to try a lot of things. I think that can be healthy. There's this business author, Jim Collins, who's got a book, Great by Choice, and he talks about a dynamic he observes in successful businesses called fire bullets, then cannonballs. People have this mindset that you should have focus on one thing, and I felt a bit of internal conflict about that, because I often would get advice from other people in the entrepreneurship space that you need to really focus deeply on one thing at a time and don't get distracted by a lot of businesses. But I think it can actually be healthy in the early stages to try lots of different ideas and essentially focus on the customer development side, but don't get wedded too early to any of the ideas, and instead to try them out and see which one gets some initial traction. And then my third tip would be to have other people working on it with you, because I found that I have an initial spurt of excitement. I get into hyperfocus and I build an app in a weekend. But then after that, the excitement dies off and I'm unlikely to make much progress. And often I don't actually get it to the point where it's releasable, where other people can use it. But if I can have a team working with me on it, then I can actually take advantage of them being a lot more content with working on one thing. And that dynamic works really well. It does, of course, require that you have the money to pay for other people, or that you are able to enlist other people to work on it in an equity arrangement. That's where the customer development piece is important. I've done pre-sales for some of my businesses where, for example, with the SMS app, when I wanted to build a mobile app, I didn't have the revenue to be able to hire a mobile app developer. So what I did was I actually reached out to customers and said, this is what I'm going to build. Would you like to purchase an upfront license to it? And people actually trusted me enough to give me $500 per business to build their share of the mobile app. And that meant that I had the cash available to hire a mobile app developer. And that's something that I think if the customer development side is done well, in terms of getting very clear on the problem and helping people to see what the solution will be, they might be willing to put some cash into it and then help to fund the development.
Those are absolutely great tips that you've given. You mentioned at the tail end of that regarding teams. And this is interesting in the aspect of when we look at startups, there's very little cash. It's all about generating revenue to be able to get to the next phase. So in that kind of dynamic, diversity and inclusion is furthest from the mind. What would you suggest from your experience on how startups, particularly if it happens to be a neurodiverse startup, and how they could be more inclusive to other neurodiversities?
Yeah, it's something that may have more of a time cost than a financial cost, because I don't think it's necessarily more expensive to hire someone who's neurodivergent, and it may actually be that it could be in some cases cheaper, because someone who has had difficulty with being in the workforce, it may be that it could be one of their first stable jobs, and it might be something where, yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about taking advantage of people who are neurodistinct, but there may be situations where people who've got a lot more work experience because they have thrived in the neurotypical work world, they may need a lot more money in order to be hired than someone who is a bit newer in their career. So that the time cost may be the issue there, in terms of if the organization is set up in a way where the processes are very much geared around communicating to neurotypical people, where there's an expectation that if I have a conversation verbally, that the other person's going to get it and they're going to remember and they're going to do that task. That's not going to work well for someone like me, where I'm okay now. I tend to take copious notes, but in my early career, I wasn't very good at remembering to do things if it was just expressed verbally. And I did a much better job if it was written down. I think that there can be a lot of changes that can be made in terms of, for example, accommodating working from home rather than expecting people to work in the office, making sure that when we're talking about a project, that maybe it's good to discuss it verbally, but I find what is a good combination for me with my teams is to have a verbal discussion where we can do a screen share and I can point things out. But as we are discussing it, I'm making notes and I'm actually populating the Jira ticket. Jira is a project management tool normally used in software teams, so that when the person looks back at it a couple of weeks later, they've got all of the notes and that they're not going to forget the context. And then I guess the other thing in terms of my current business with Focus Bear, I don't have a lot of budget. And what I've done is I've hired people in other countries where I'm able to pay them a really good rate for their local area, but it's not what I would pay for someone in Australia, because I'd probably have to pay in some cases 5 times more for someone in Australia compared to someone overseas. And there may be opportunities. There are programs that I'd like to look at where in Australia, I think there are programs where there can be some government support for hiring someone who is potentially part of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, who might be autistic or who might have other neurodiversities there. That's something that I'd like to do, because it would be great to work with people in Australia as well. But for now, what I've been doing is I've sought out people who identify as being neurodiverse, because I think especially for Focus Bear, where we're attempting to build software for people with ADHD and other neurodiversities, it's pretty important that the team can empathize and the team has ideas that they can contribute themselves. And I've found that to be really effective. And I think some of the downsides of say ADHD, where I find it very hard to get immersed in a task which isn't interesting to me. Part of the issue there is if I'm working for a company where I don't care about their product, if I'm working for a company that's doing taxation software, for example, it's pretty hard for me to have intrinsic motivation for that. I don't really care that much about taxes, but I do care about helping myself and helping other people with ADHD. And the last couple of companies I've worked at where it's been in the climate change space, I felt a strong motivation to write that code because I feel like we're having an impact here. And it's not that I'm just working for a paycheck. It's that I'm working for a company whose mission I resonate with. So that's probably a recommendation, that you build a company, if you're wanting to get into entrepreneurship, build a company that will be financially sustainable, but importantly, a company that you're passionate about and that you can rally a team around that vision. And that's going to help people with ADHD, especially, to feel like the work has meaning and to be able to prioritize it.
Understandable, and I completely agree. And you've given a very interesting picture as well, the time cost. That's a really interesting perspective that you've given there. And I take it you mean by the time cost, if I understood correctly, the time cost in being able for the neurodiversity individual to communicate and to understand what's being communicated to them is what you meant, correct?
Yeah. And I personally don't experience the time cost. I think in the same way as the people in my team who identify as neurodiverse, it hasn't really been a time cost. In fact, it's felt like I work better with them than I work with neurotypical people in some ways. We just seem to think along the same wavelengths. But I can imagine a situation where an organization that is more set up for a neurotypical workspace, they might find that it feels like they have to work harder, that they have to spend more time communicating because they're, instead of doing it predominantly just in a verbal manner, they might have to do a lot more documentation. But for me, I prefer doing things written. Most of the time, I prefer doing things async, and it doesn't feel like there's a time cost for me.
Right. So what you're talking about, and I totally understand what you're talking about and relate to it, is that it's a working memory issue. It's an executive function issue, what you're talking about. I suffer from the same thing where I need to make notes, and I didn't realize that until much later in my life. But it comes down to the organization or to the people adapting to how that person receives information and how they communicate. And often I refer this in regards to working memory and processing speed, which is you need to give people time to be able to receive the information, give them time to be able to process the information, and then give them time to be able to act upon that particular information that they've just processed. And there's that impatience or that they've given it verbally, and you may come back and say, you know, I've got maybe the first 2 points, but the other 5 points I've completely missed, or I need clarification. And there's that struggle that happens that you're talking about in regards to time costs. And it's I like the term that you've used there, time costs. It's a really good term. So let's get right to it then. And because you mentioned the app, and I want to get to the app. So you've touched upon it a little bit, and I want to get a little bit more deeper into it. What is it about the app that drew you to wanting to create it?
The motivation for me was mainly around some of the challenges that I was having during the sale of my last business, where that became very all-encompassing, that I was running the business. I had another job at the time, and I was also spending time dealing with accountants and lawyers. And it was just squeezing all of my spare time to the extent that I wasn't really meditating. I wasn't doing much exercise, even though that I knew that essentially meditation and exercise are really important for me to be able to feel calm and to feel happy and to be able to concentrate as well. And yet I would wake up in the morning and I'd have this sense of anxiety that I knew that there would be customer emails from people in the US. And I felt a strong motivation to immediately go to my computer and check those emails. And once I did that, I wouldn't do my meditation. I'd get caught in a whirlwind of hyperfocus for the next couple of hours, and I wouldn't go back to it. I wanted something that would interrupt my behavior, that would essentially only unlock my email once I had done some of those healthy habits. And that's the tool that we built originally around having a sequence of activities that would sequentially unlock. So I start my day by going for a walk around the block, and then I do some journaling, and then I do some yoga. And then after that, I've spent about half an hour. I'm in a good headspace, and then I can access my emails. And then, but only for 20 minutes. Because I have a tendency that there is a need for me to check in the morning, because I do have US customers. But after that, normally there isn't really that many things that I need to fix, and I can actually then go and do a workout. So I do then a 45-minute yoga or weights workout, and then after that I get into my workday. And that experience of being able to guide my attention, that was what I wanted to create, where I could set out the night before what I wanted to do in my morning routine. And then I don't have this part of me saying, oh, but I should really check my emails instead, or I should go and check out TikTok in case there's something exciting there. That impulsive part of me is overridden by what my planning self has put into practice the night before. That Focus Bear guides me through each of the activities on my computer and my phone. And then I find it really easy to go along with that, that if I don't have the structure in place, then I find it hard to think about what would be healthy for me to do. But when I've got the nudge there, where it's basically, it comes up on my screen and it says, hey, it's time to do yoga now. And I click start 15 minutes of yoga. And then it shows a YouTube video and I follow along to the YouTube video for 15 minutes. And it's very easy for me to do that. Whereas if I just have it on a checklist or something saying do yoga in the morning, I'm unlikely to actually follow through with that consistently. Yeah, that's one part of it. And then the other aspect was distraction blocking. I've used a lot of apps like Freedom and Cold Turkey, which aim to block distractions, but I found that they didn't really work for my ADHD self, where I have multiple different projects and multiple different businesses and jobs that I'm doing. And actually, the type of websites that are distracting, it depends on the type of work that I'm doing. So it could be that when I'm working for my day job, the GitHub page, which is where I put code for my side project, that's actually a distraction. I shouldn't really be there during that time. But I found that with a lot of the other apps, they didn't really cater for that multimodality, where at different times in the day, I should be using a different set of apps and websites. So with Focus Bear, I've got it set up where I've got a day job focus mode, which has websites allowed that are related to my day job. And then I've got my Focus Bear focus mode, which is for when I'm working on Focus Bear. And I've got a few other different modes as well, depending on the type of work that I'm doing. And I essentially hit play and I then lock myself into focusing on that narrow set of websites. Because I find that the other aspect too, that say with Freedom, I can nominate blocked websites, but it's very hard for me to actually have a comprehensive set of blocked websites, because what I found was that I have often a bad habit of going and reading the news as a way of dealing with anxiety, even though it actually creates more anxiety. And I had blocked the obvious news sites, but then I just Google like what's happening in Ukraine right now. And then I'd find myself going onto these really obscure, low quality news sites. And there are so many of them that I couldn't possibly come up with a comprehensive list. So instead, it's much better for me to have a safe list or an allow list where I nominate what websites are safe for me to use, and then everything else gets blocked automatically. They're the two key features, the morning routine and the distraction blocking. And I find that the morning routine really does set me up well for the day, that when I meditate and when I do exercise, I'm far less likely to be highly distractible. And actually, just the third feature is around taking breaks, because with the hyper focus, I can get into this state where I'm hunched over my keyboard and I'm developing a very bad posture. And then by the end of the day, I sometimes get quite bad neck pain and headaches. Whereas if I stand up regularly and I remember to drink water and I do some stretching, then I find that I don't get the headaches, and I also have more consistent energy levels. I think it probably helps. I do things like I do 30 seconds of push-ups every 20 minutes, and I find raising my heart rate a little bit, it seems to help with my ability to focus as well. That's something that they talk about in the ADHD 2.0 book, that having opportunities to have some release of energy is quite helpful for people with ADHD, that there's probably a part of us that just needs to go and run around for a little bit. And then in schools, you have recess. I don't necessarily have that during the workday. So I wanted to create that for myself. And that's been really helpful in terms of focus and general life satisfaction as well.
Well, this seems a very helpful and intense app that you've designed. And when would this app be available? Is it currently available?
Yeah, we have the Mac, Windows, and Android app currently available, and iOS is coming out soon.
Okay, and then you mentioned during a prep talk that for this app, you are in need of beta testers.
Yeah, I'd love people to try it out. So it's available at focusbear.io. You can download it from there. And I'm aware we talked earlier about the financial barriers to getting a diagnosis. There may also be financial barriers for people being able to afford a subscription, where we're offering it for $5 per month normally to pay for the development and server costs. But if anyone has difficulties in terms of being able to afford that, I'm happy to provide free licenses as well if they contact me at jeremy@focusbear.io.
Fantastic. So it's available on PC, it's available on Mac, it's available on Android app, and you're currently in the process of developing it for iOS. They can go onto the website and get access to being a beta tester. It's €5 a month. And if they're having difficulty, you can provide a workaround for them.
Yeah, I can provide free access for people who need it.
Fantastic. Well, Jeremy, we have definitely covered a lot here, and you've not only shared your wonderful journey with us, but you've also gave great advice on how to cope with one's neurodiversity, how to be a successful entrepreneur, and as well as providing a really great app to help neurodivergents to be able to focus and concentrate. And I love the focus modes, because I also use cold turkey, and some of the problems that you've mentioned I've run into. So I definitely, I'm glad to hear there's a solution for that. And take it, the best way to get in touch with you then will be through the Focus Bear website?
Yeah, either that or via LinkedIn or email. So maybe I can provide those details and we can include them in the show notes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Jeremy, I want to thank you for being our guest and sharing your story and for introducing us to your app. I want to encourage you to continue supporting this podcast so I can bring you more amazing content. You can do so by visiting my Patreon page, where you can come in direct contact with me in several options. Till next time, take a leap and transform.